The wind tugged at Arthur Donovan's coat as he stood before the towering gates of Children's Haven Orphanage, his hand resting on the cool iron. He'd been here before, once or twice for charity events, but this visit was different. It wasn't about business, public relations, or expanding his empire. Today, he felt an inexplicable pull, a sense of dread mixed with curiosity, as though something significant awaited him beyond those gates. Arthur had always been a man of control, a man who thrived in the cutthroat world of entrepreneurship, where every decision was calculated, every move a step closer to success. But as the years passed, his vast fortune had become a mask, hiding the deep wound that festered beneath his carefully constructed exterior. The loss of his son, Andrew, 15 years ago in that horrific car accident, had shattered something inside him. No amount of wealth could ever fill the void left by his 7-year-old boy. His heart beat faster as he walked through the orphanage's courtyard. Laughter echoed around him. Children playing on swings, chasing each other with wide, carefree smiles. For a moment, the world felt lighter, less cruel, as Arthur paused to observe them. It was a sharp contrast to the sorrow he carried. But today, the laughter didn't bring the usual pang of grief. Instead, it stirred something deeper, an unsettling anticipation. He continued walking toward the main building, hands deep in his coat pockets, when his gaze landed on a group of children gathered in a far corner of the playground. And then he saw him. Arthur froze. A boy stood apart from the group, tall for his age, with dark, slightly unruly hair that curled at the ends. He had a quiet presence, his focus on something in the distance, as though lost in his own thoughts. But it wasn't the boy's demeanor that caught Arthur's breath. It was the striking resemblance to Andrew. The same deep blue eyes, the same unruly dark hair. Even the way he tilted his head reminded Arthur of Andrew at that age. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the playground faded, and all Arthur could do was stare. It couldn't be. His pulse quickened, his heart hammering against his chest as the impossible thought crept into his mind. Andrew had died. The accident, the funeral, he had buried his son. He had mourned for years, struggling to move on, barely holding his life together. Yet, standing just a few yards away was a boy who could have been Andrew's twin. Arthur's feet felt rooted to the ground. His hands trembled slightly as he forced himself to breathe, to regain control. It's just a coincidence, he told himself. Children look alike all the time. But the longer he watched, the more his doubt gnawed at him. The boy had that same quiet intensity, that same way of observing the world that Arthur remembered so well. His chest tightened with an unbearable mix of hope and disbelief. "Mr. Donovan?" A soft voice broke his trance. Arthur blinked and turned to see Mrs. Collins, the headmistress of the orphanage, walking toward him with a warm smile. Her silver hair was tied in a neat bun, and she wore the kind of gentle expression that immediately put others at ease. "Ah, Mrs. Collins," Arthur said, forcing himself to return her smile. "Sorry, I got a bit lost in thought." She glanced toward the playground. "It happens sometimes. The children tend to draw people in, especially those who haven't been around such young energy for a while." Arthur nodded, his mind still on the boy. He was tempted to ask about him but hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question without sounding mad. Instead, he followed Mrs. Collins as she led him toward the orphanage office. But his eyes kept drifting back to the boy. Inside the building, they settled into a small, cozy room adorned with children's artwork and shelves of donated books. The warmth of the room should have been comforting, but Arthur's mind raced. The image of the boy lingered, haunting him like a specter from the past. "Everything all right, Mr. Donovan?" Mrs. Collins asked as she poured him a cup of tea. Arthur cleared his throat, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "That boy out there, the one by the swing set. Who is he?" Mrs. Collins looked up, surprised by the sudden change in his tone. "Oh, you must mean Ethan. He's one of our older children. Been with us for quite some time now." Ethan. The name echoed in Arthur's mind, unfamiliar yet somehow heavy with meaning. "How long has he been here?" "Since he was a baby," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "He was left at our doorstep when he was just a few months old. No records of his parents, no identifying information. We've tried to find out more about his background, but, she trailed off, shaking her head. It's one of those heartbreaking stories. He's been in the system ever since. Arthur's heart sank. He had expected to hear something, anything, that would explain the resemblance, something that would prove it was all a coincidence. But the mystery of Ethan's origins only deepened his unease. Mrs. Collins tilted her head, studying Arthur's expression. Why do you ask? Did something about him catch your attention? Arthur hesitated. How could he explain it without sounding irrational? How could he tell this kind woman that he had just seen a ghost of his past? He just reminded me of someone I used to know. My son. Actually, the room fell into a heavy silence. Mrs. Collins' expression softened. She knew about Arthur's loss. The tragic story of Andrew's death was one of those tales whispered in social circles, a reminder that even the wealthiest among them could not escape heartbreak. I see, she said gently. I understand how difficult these things can be. Sometimes, our minds play tricks on us when we haven't fully healed. Arthur nodded, though her words didn't bring the comfort they were intended to. His gaze drifted back to the window, where Ethan was still playing. Was it possible? Could Ethan be connected to Andrew in ways Arthur hadn't yet discovered? He stood abruptly, feeling the weight of an invisible force pulling him back to the boy. Thank you, Mrs. Collins, he said, forcing a polite smile. I think I'll head back outside for a moment. And with that, Arthur walked out, the thought taking root in his mind. What if this boy, this mysterious child, is somehow a part of the son I lost? Arthur Donovan couldn't shake the image of Ethan as he left the cozy warmth of Mrs. Collins' office. The moment he stepped back into the courtyard, his gaze immediately sought out the boy, as though pulled by an invisible thread. The same dark curls, the same blue eyes. Every glance at Ethan stirred memories of Andrew that Arthur had buried for 15 years. But this wasn't about sentimentality, Arthur told himself. There was something more, something real. He needed answers. Over the next week, Arthur found excuses to return to Children's Haven, arranging donations, inquiring about upcoming charity events, anything that would allow him another look at the boy. His sudden involvement in the orphanage raised no suspicions. After all, his wealth had made him a prominent benefactor for several children's organizations. But his visits weren't about charity anymore. They were about Ethan. Each time he saw Ethan, Arthur's heart would race with the impossible hope that this boy could somehow be connected to his son. He knew it was irrational, knew that every encounter was slowly unraveling the control he'd spent years maintaining, but he couldn't stop. Ethan drew him in, and Arthur found himself spending more and more time observing the boy from a distance. One afternoon, as Arthur stood by the playground watching Ethan from afar, Mrs. Collins approached him with a gentle but concerned expression. Mr. Donovan, you've been visiting us quite often lately, she said kindly, but her eyes hinted at something more. I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right? Arthur hesitated. He hadn't expected to be confronted so soon, but Mrs. Collins' perceptive nature didn't surprise him. She was, after all, responsible for the well-being of dozens of children, each with their own stories of loss and hardship. I've just taken an interest in the work you do here, Arthur said, trying to sound casual. It's inspiring, really. These kids, they need all the support they can get. Mrs. Collins nodded, but the way she looked at him made it clear she wasn't buying the explanation. I know you've been through a lot, Mr. Donovan, she said gently. Losing a child, it's something no one ever fully recovers from. But I've seen the way you look at Ethan. Arthur stiffened, his defenses immediately rising. What do you mean? I mean, she continued, her tone soft but firm, Ethan is a very special boy, but he's also fragile. Many of our children are. They've been through things that most of us can't imagine, and they can form attachments easily. I just want to make sure you understand that. Arthur swallowed hard, feeling a twinge of guilt. I'm not trying to harm him. I don't think you are, Mrs. Collins replied, her voice full of empathy. But sometimes, when we're hurting, we look for things in others that remind us of what we've lost. I've seen it happen before. Just be careful, for both your sake and Ethan's. Arthur nodded, but Mrs. Collins' words only intensified the conflict raging inside him. He knew she was right. He was projecting his grief onto Ethan, seeing his son in the boy who had no connection to him. And yet, something deep inside told him that there was more to this than just a resemblance. That night, after another sleepless few hours of tossing and turning, Arthur made a decision. He couldn't ignore the pull anymore. He needed answers, and if the orphanage couldn't provide them, he would have to find them himself. The next morning, he contacted Nick Roberts, a private investigator he'd worked with in the past on business matters. Nick was reliable, discreet, and known for uncovering hidden truths, no matter how deep they were buried. "Nick, I need you to look into someone for me," Arthur said over the phone, trying to sound professional, even as his pulse quickened. "There's a boy at an orphanage. I need to know everything about him, where he came from, who his parents were, how he ended up there." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "A boy at an orphanage?" Nick's voice held a hint of confusion. "Arthur, that's not your usual request. What's going on?" Arthur sighed, running a hand through his hair. I need to know. Nick, it's personal." Nick didn't press further. "All right," he said. "I'll get started right away. But you'll have to give me access to the orphanage's records. That might take some time." "I'll handle that," Arthur said quickly. "Just start digging. I'll make sure you get what you need." For the next few days, Arthur returned to Children's Haven with renewed determination, his mind racing with questions. He watched Ethan closely, hoping the boy would reveal some hidden truth about his past. But Ethan was just a child, innocent, quiet, and unaware of the storm brewing around him. The boy seemed to have no idea that Arthur's life was slowly unraveling with every visit. Meanwhile, Nick began his investigation, combing through whatever scraps of information he could find about Ethan's background. But the more Nick searched, the more he hit dead ends. There were no birth records, no known relatives, no details about how the boy had arrived at the orphanage. Just a note in the orphanage's files saying that Ethan had been found on their doorstep as an infant, with no clue to his origins. As the investigation dragged on, Arthur's obsession deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was hiding the truth from him. The resemblance was too strong, the timing too coincidental. Ethan had arrived at the orphanage just a few months after Andrew's death. Could it really be just a fluke? His wife, Jessica, noticed the change in him. Over dinner one evening, she finally voiced her concern. "Arthur, what's going on with you lately? You've been distracted, distant, and you're spending so much time at that orphanage. What's really happening?" Arthur hesitated, not wanting to drag her into the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But Jessica had always been perceptive, especially when it came to matters of the heart. "It's that boy," he admitted quietly, staring down at his plate. "Ethan, he looks just like Andrew." Jessica's fork clattered against the table as she froze, her face going pale. "What? Arthur, that's impossible." "I know how it sounds," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't ignore it. I've had Nick looking into his past, but there's nothing. No records, no family, nothing. Jess, what if Andrew didn't die the way we thought? What if Ethan is connected to him somehow?" Jessica's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Arthur, you're grasping at straws. Andrew is gone. You know that." "Do I?" Arthur shot back, his voice rising with desperation. "Do I really know that? I wasn't there when it happened, Jess. They told us he was gone, but what if they were wrong?" Jessica shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Arthur, please, you have to stop. This obsession, it's going to destroy you." But Arthur couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close to finding out the truth. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Arthur knew that he was crossing a line. He was venturing into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back. He needed to know, once and for all, who Ethan really was, and if the boy was the key to healing the wound that had never truly closed. The tension in the Donovan household had been building for weeks. Arthur's obsession with Ethan was no longer something Jessica could ignore, and the weight of it hung heavy in the air between them. Every night, Arthur would retreat into his study, poring over papers from the orphanage, looking for any trace of Ethan's origins, while Jessica lay awake in their bed, her mind spinning with worry. Their once loving home had turned into a battlefield of silence and unspoken fears. One evening, Jessica could no longer keep quiet. She found Arthur in his study, surrounded by documents and private investigator reports. His face was etched with exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes from too many sleepless nights. He barely looked up as she entered the room. "Arthur," Jessica said softly, standing in the doorway. Her voice carried the tremble of someone on the edge of breaking. "We need to talk." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know what you're going to say, Jess, but you have to understand." "No," she cut him off, her voice firmer now. "You need to understand. This thing with Ethan, it's consuming you. You're losing yourself. We're losing you." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but Arthur couldn't tear himself away from the investigation. He looked up at her, frustration mingling with desperation in his eyes. "I can't just walk away, Jessica. There's something about Ethan. I feel it. He looks just like Andrew. The timing, the details, there has to be a connection." Jessica took a step forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. "Arthur, listen to yourself. You're chasing a ghost. Andrew is gone. You need to accept that, or this obsession will destroy us. It's already tearing us apart." Arthur felt the sting of her words, but he couldn't let go. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan's story. "I'm not crazy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something there, Jess. I just know it." Jessica's shoulders slumped, her strength crumbling in the face of his relentless determination. "Arthur, I miss him too. Every day. But you have to stop this before it destroys our family. I can't keep living like this, waiting for you to come back from some imaginary world where Andrew is alive. You're not here with me, with us. You're with him." For the first time, Arthur looked up, really looked at her. Jessica's eyes were brimming with unshed tears, her hands trembling. She had been strong for so long, but now she was at her breaking point. "I'm trying to move on, Arthur," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're holding on so tight to something that isn't there. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to process my grief. But how can I heal when you keep tearing the wound open?" Her confession hit Arthur like a sledgehammer. Jessica had been struggling too, in silence, while he buried himself in the search for answers about Ethan. The weight of his own obsession suddenly felt unbearable. "Jessica," his voice faltered, guilt crashing over him. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "You didn't ask," she replied softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Because you've been too focused on Ethan, on finding some version of Andrew in him. But Arthur, that's not fair to Ethan. And it's not fair to me." Arthur stood, moving toward her, his heart aching. He reached out to touch her arm, but Jessica pulled away, shaking her head. "I love you, Arthur," she said, her voice full of pain. "But if you don't let this go, if you don't come back to me, I don't know how much longer I can stay." Her words echoed in the room, heavy with the threat of finality. Arthur's stomach twisted as the reality of the situation set in. His marriage, the one thing he had left after Andrew's death, was slipping through his fingers, and he hadn't even noticed. "I don't want to lose you," Arthur whispered, his voice raw. "Then stop pushing me away," Jessica replied. "Stop chasing something that's already gone." Arthur stared at her, torn between the love he felt for his wife and the deep, gnawing need for answers about Ethan. He knew she was right. His obsession was driving a wedge between them, but the idea of walking away from Ethan now, when he was so close to uncovering the truth, felt impossible. Later that night, as he lay awake in bed, Arthur's mind raced. Jessica had fallen asleep beside him, her breathing steady, but Arthur's thoughts refused to settle. His marriage was on the brink of collapse, and yet, all he could think about was Ethan. How much he resembled Andrew, the timing of his arrival at the orphanage, the missing pieces of his past. Could it really be a coincidence? Or was Ethan truly connected to his son in a way he had yet to discover? His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Nick, the private investigator. "I found something. Call me in the morning." Arthur's pulse quickened, and a wave of conflicted emotions washed over him. He glanced at Jessica, sleeping peacefully, then back at the message. He knew that if he continued down this path, he risked losing her for good. But he also knew that he couldn't turn back now, not with the possibility of answers so close. As the darkness of the night stretched on, Arthur felt trapped between two worlds. One that offered the hope of uncovering the truth about Ethan, and another that promised the possibility of saving his marriage. But he could feel time slipping away, and he knew he couldn't hold on to both. He had to choose. The morning after Jessica's ultimatum weighed heavy on Arthur's mind, but he couldn't shake the need for answers about Ethan. Despite everything Jessica had said, the possibility that this boy was connected to Andrew still gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. And now, with Nick's message fresh in his mind, Arthur knew he was on the verge of uncovering something. He called Nick as soon as the sun came up, pacing his study while the phone rang. His heart raced with a mix of anticipation and dread, knowing this conversation could change everything. When Nick answered, his voice was calm and direct, as always. "Arthur, I've been looking into Ethan's file more closely, and I found something odd," Nick began without preamble. "The orphanage's paperwork doesn't add up. There's no trace of Ethan's birth records, nothing about his family or how he came to be at the orphanage, aside from a note that he was found on their doorstep. But it's the timing that's strange." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Nick hesitated before continuing, as though carefully considering his next words. "Ethan was dropped off at Children's Haven around the same time your son, Andrew, passed away. There's no exact date, but the records show that he arrived there roughly 2 weeks after Andrew's accident." Arthur's chest tightened. He felt a cold rush of disbelief flood through him. 2 weeks after Andrew's death? It couldn't be just a coincidence. His mind raced, connecting the dots. Ethan's striking resemblance to Andrew, the locket, the timing. It was all too much to ignore. "But that's not all," Nick continued, his voice low. "I tracked down a nurse who used to work at the hospital where Andrew was taken after the accident. She's retired now, but she remembered something unusual about that day." Arthur's heart thudded in his chest. He gripped the phone tighter. "Go on." "She mentioned that there was some confusion at the hospital that day," Nick said slowly, as though weighing each word carefully. "It was chaotic, multiple trauma cases coming in from the accident. She hinted at a mix-up with the patients, but she wasn't clear on the details. She's older now, and her memory is fuzzy, but she did recall that there were rumors about a baby being declared dead prematurely." Arthur felt his stomach drop. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. A mix-up? Could Andrew have been mistaken for another child? Was it possible that his son hadn't died at all, that somehow Ethan had been swept up in this confusion and abandoned at the orphanage? "This doesn't make sense," Arthur muttered, running a hand through his hair. "How could a hospital mix up something so important?" "It's rare, but it happens," Nick replied calmly. "In the chaos of trauma cases, especially with multiple victims, there's a slim chance that a mistake was made. But that's all I have right now, rumors and inconsistencies. I'm not saying Ethan is your son, but it's worth looking into further." Arthur felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. For years, he had believed Andrew was gone. He had buried his son, mourned him, grieved for him. But now, there was a flicker of hope, however faint, that Andrew might still be alive, that Ethan could be his lost child. The thought was impossible, yet it consumed him. "What do I do next?" Arthur asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I'd suggest we dig deeper," Nick replied. "I can look into the hospital records, see if there's anything concrete about a baby being misidentified. It'll take time, though." Arthur nodded, though Nick couldn't see him. "Do it. Whatever it takes, I need to know." After ending the call, Arthur sat in his study for a long time, staring at the phone in his hand. His thoughts spun out of control, the faint glimmer of hope battling with the fear of disappointment. If there had been a mistake, if Ethan was Andrew, it would mean that everything he had believed for the past 15 years was wrong. It would mean that his son had been alive all this time. But if Nick was wrong, if this was just another dead end, Arthur wasn't sure how he'd handle it. He had already pushed Jessica to the brink. His business was suffering. His life was crumbling under the weight of his obsession. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions but barely present. Jessica noticed his distraction, and though she didn't say anything, Arthur could feel the distance between them growing. She had been right about one thing. His search for answers was destroying their marriage. But how could he stop now? That evening, as Arthur sat alone in his study, staring at the locket Andrew used to wear, Jessica walked in. She stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "I can't do this anymore, Arthur," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't watch you tear yourself apart over this. I love you, but I'm losing you to something that doesn't exist." Arthur looked up, his heart aching at the sight of her. "Jess, I think there's something you need to know." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, Arthur. I don't want to hear about Ethan again. I can't. This is killing us." Arthur stood, moving toward her, his hands trembling. "It's not just Ethan, Jess. I spoke to Nick. He found out that there might have been a mistake at the hospital the day Andrew died. A mix-up. There's a chance Andrew could still be alive. That's why I can't stop." Jessica's face paled, her mouth falling open in shock. For a moment, she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of his words. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I don't know for sure," Arthur admitted, his voice trembling. "But Nick is looking into it. There are gaps in Ethan's past, things that don't add up. And if there's even the slightest chance that Ethan could be Andrew, I have to find out. I owe it to him. To us." Jessica stared at him, her expression unreadable. The room was filled with a silence so heavy that it seemed to suffocate them both. "Arthur," she finally whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks, "if you go down this path, I don't know if I can follow you." Arthur's heart shattered at her words, but he knew there was no other choice. He couldn't let go of the possibility, no matter how small, that Ethan was his son. The truth had to be uncovered, even if it cost him everything. "I have to know, Jess," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I have to know if Andrew is out there." Jessica turned away, her sobs quiet but uncontrollable as she walked out of the study, leaving Arthur standing in the empty room, alone with his grief, his hope, and the fear that he was on the brink of losing everything, except the one thing that still mattered, the truth about Ethan. Arthur couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling as Jessica's words echoed in his mind. "If you go down this path, I don't know if I can follow you." He was tearing his marriage apart, but there was no turning back. The thought that Andrew might still be alive consumed him. He needed to know the truth about Ethan, no matter the cost. The next morning, Arthur found himself back at Children's Haven, more determined than ever to find answers. The orphanage's courtyard was quiet, the early morning sunlight casting long shadows over the playground. As he walked toward the main building, his eyes once again searched for Ethan. The boy was sitting alone on a bench, his head down as he drew something in a small notebook. Arthur's heart tightened. It was an all-too-familiar sight. Andrew had loved to sit outside and sketch in his own little notebook. The resemblance between Ethan and his late son wasn't just physical anymore. There were small, almost imperceptible mannerisms, ways of being that made Arthur's chest ache with both hope and fear. He approached the boy cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Ethan," he said softly, standing a few feet away. Ethan looked up, his blue eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, they locked eyes, and Arthur felt his pulse quicken. The boy gave him a shy smile. "Hi, Mr. Donovan." Arthur smiled back, his throat tight. "What are you drawing?" Ethan glanced down at the notebook in his lap. "Just the playground," he mumbled, turning the page slightly as if embarrassed by his work. Arthur moved closer, lowering himself onto the bench beside Ethan. He glanced at the drawing. Simple but detailed. The swings, the slide, the trees that lined the courtyard. It reminded him of Andrew's sketches, the way his son had captured moments of their world with such care. "That's really good," Arthur said, his voice catching slightly. "You've got talent." Ethan shrugged, clearly unused to compliments, and returned his focus to the page. Arthur watched him for a moment, the weight of his suspicions pressing heavily on his chest. He wanted to say something, to ask the boy outright if he remembered anything about his past, but he knew he couldn't push too hard. Not yet. Instead, Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the small locket that Andrew used to wear. It was simple, silver, with a small engraving of Andrew's initials on the back. Arthur had found it the night before, buried in an old box of his son's belongings, and seeing it again had nearly undone him. "Can I show you something?" Arthur asked, holding out the locket. Ethan looked at the small object in Arthur's palm, his eyes widening with curiosity. "What is it?" "This belonged to someone very special to me," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My son, Andrew. He used to wear it all the time." Ethan stared at the locket, then back at Arthur, his expression unreadable. Arthur felt a wave of desperation wash over him. He wanted so badly for the boy to say something, to recognize the locket, to show some sign that he was connected to Andrew. But Ethan remained silent, his eyes flicking between Arthur's face and the locket. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan spoke. I think I've seen something like that before." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" he asked quickly, trying to keep his voice calm. Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. "I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But it looks like a locket I found once, a long time ago. I think I lost it, though." Arthur's mind raced. Could it be possible that Ethan had once come across Andrew's belongings? Was this locket part of a puzzle that would lead him to the truth? His hands trembled as he held the locket closer, showing Ethan the initials engraved on the back. "These letters," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "Do they mean anything to you? Have you seen them before?" Ethan leaned in, squinting at the letters. After a long pause, he shook his head. "No, I don't think so." The knot in Arthur's stomach tightened. He had been so sure, but now he felt like he was grasping at straws. He let out a deep breath, the weight of disappointment crushing him. But then Ethan spoke again. "There was something else, though," the boy said quietly, almost to himself. "I had this other thing, a picture, I think, of someone, but I don't know where it went." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "A picture? Of who?" "I don't remember," Ethan admitted, frowning as though trying to reach into the fog of his past. "It was a long time ago. Mrs. Collins might know. She kept some of my stuff when I first came here." Arthur's pulse quickened. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. If there was a photo, it could be the key to proving Ethan's connection to Andrew. He stood abruptly, the surge of hope almost dizzying. "Do you think she still has it?" Arthur asked urgently, trying to keep his voice steady. Ethan shrugged. "Maybe. She keeps all the old stuff in her office, I think." Without wasting another second, Arthur walked toward the orphanage's main building. He could feel his hands shaking, his mind racing with the possibilities. This could be it. The photo might be the final piece of the puzzle. If there was a chance that Ethan had once been linked to Andrew's life, Arthur needed to know. Inside the office, Mrs. Collins greeted him with her usual calm demeanor, though Arthur could sense her quiet concern. She had noticed his growing attachment to Ethan, and though she hadn't spoken to him directly about it, Arthur knew she was watching closely. "Mr. Donovan," she said, setting aside some paperwork, "what brings you back so soon?" Arthur wasted no time. Ethan mentioned that he used to have some personal belongings when he first arrived. "A photo, specifically. He thinks you might still have it." Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. "Ethan's personal belongings? I don't recall a photo, but I can check the records and the storage. We do keep items that children bring with them when they arrive, especially if they're important." Arthur's heart raced. "Please, it's important." Mrs. Collins studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Give me a few minutes." As she left to search through the orphanage's storage, Arthur stood in the office, barely able to contain his anticipation. He paced the floor, running over all the details in his mind. The hospital mix-up, the timing, the locket. Everything seemed to be pointing in one direction, toward the boy who could be his son. If this photo was what he hoped it would be, Arthur's life would never be the same. After what felt like hours, Mrs. Collins returned, holding a small, tattered folder in her hands. Arthur's breath caught as she approached. "This is all we have from when Ethan first came to us," she said gently, handing the folder to Arthur. "There's not much, but maybe you'll find what you're looking for." With trembling hands, Arthur opened the folder. Inside, there were a few worn pieces of paper, a child's drawing, and a photograph. His heart slammed against his chest as he pulled out the photo, his fingers shaking. It was faded and worn, but there was no mistaking the face in the picture. Arthur's breath left him in a rush, his knees almost buckling under the weight of what he saw. The photo was of Andrew. Arthur's mind reeled as he stared at the picture, his vision blurring with tears. There, standing next to a much younger Ethan, was his son. The same smile, the same eyes. His son was alive. Somehow, Ethan had been with him, or connected to him, after all these years. It was real. He wasn't chasing ghosts. This boy, Ethan, was the key to everything he had been searching for. His hand trembled as he looked up at Mrs. Collins, who stood watching him carefully. This is my son," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "That's Andrew." Mrs. Collins' eyes widened in shock. She had no idea of the significance of the photo, but she could see the devastation and hope flooding Arthur's face. I didn't know," she murmured. "I thought." But Arthur wasn't listening anymore. His entire world had just shifted, and he could only think of one thing. "Ethan is my son. I found him. And now, nothing would stop him from bringing Ethan home." Arthur stood frozen, staring at the faded photograph of his son, Andrew, standing next to a younger Ethan. The world seemed to tilt. The floor beneath him felt as though it was slipping away. His breath came in shallow gasps as the realization settled deep into his bones. Ethan was connected to Andrew. It was undeniable now. The resemblance, the timing, and now this photograph. It wasn't a coincidence. Mrs. Collins, watching his stunned reaction, gently touched his arm, her voice soft and cautious. "Mr. Donovan, are you all right?" Arthur barely registered her words. His mind was racing, flashing through 1,000 questions, emotions battling for control inside him. How had this photo ended up with Ethan? Had Andrew somehow survived that horrible day, only to be lost to him again? He needed to understand. But above all, he needed to bring Ethan home. With a sharp inhale, Arthur regained control of his voice. "Mrs. Collins, how long have you had this photo?" The headmistress looked down at the tattered folder in her hands. "It's been here since Ethan arrived. All his belongings were stored here when he was just a baby, abandoned with no identifying information. This photo was one of the few things he had." Arthur's heart clenched. Abandoned. The word echoed in his mind, gnawing at him. If Ethan had been abandoned as a baby, who had left him? Why did he have this picture of Andrew? The questions burned in his chest, but he was too overwhelmed to form them properly. "I need to know everything," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "Everything about how Ethan got here. Every detail, every scrap of information. There has to be more. This photo, this can't just be it." Mrs. Collins frowned, her expression a mixture of sympathy and confusion. "I understand, Mr. Donovan, but we've already shared everything we know about Ethan's arrival. There's no more paperwork, no clues beyond what's in that folder." "I'm sorry." Arthur's chest tightened with frustration. He felt like he was so close, yet still so far from understanding the full truth. But as much as he wanted to dig deeper, he knew he had to step carefully. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Ethan, an innocent boy who had no idea of the storm raging around him. "I need to speak with him," Arthur said suddenly, his voice firmer now. "I need to tell him the truth. I believe Ethan is my son, or somehow connected to Andrew. He needs to know." Mrs. Collins' face paled at Arthur's words. "Mr. Donovan, I understand your need for answers, but Ethan, he's just a boy. And you're not certain yet. What if this confuses or hurts him? You must think carefully about how you proceed." Arthur knew she was right, but the urgency inside him wouldn't let go. "I can't wait any longer," he said. "I've already lost too much time." Mrs. Collins hesitated, clearly torn between her duty to protect Ethan and her sympathy for Arthur's situation. Finally, she nodded. "If you truly believe this will help, I won't stand in your way. But I urge you to be gentle. Ethan has been through so much already." Arthur nodded, though his mind was already spinning with how he would approach the conversation with Ethan. The boy had been growing closer to him over the past few weeks, opening up, bonding in small ways. But now, Arthur felt the weight of his own expectations bearing down on the child who had no idea of the truth that lay ahead. When Arthur returned to the playground, Ethan was still sitting on the bench, his notebook open on his lap, though now he seemed lost in thought. As Arthur approached, the boy looked up, offering a tentative smile. Arthur's heart ached with the weight of what he was about to say. "Ethan," Arthur began, sitting beside him. His voice was soft, but the intensity of his emotions was impossible to hide. "I need to talk to you about something important." Ethan's smile faltered as he looked up at Arthur, sensing the shift in the air. "What's wrong?" Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "There's something about your past, about who you are, that I need to share with you. I've been looking into it, and I think I found a connection between you and my son, Andrew." Ethan blinked, confusion clouding his face. "Your son?" Arthur nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, my son, Andrew, passed away in an accident 15 years ago. But there's a chance that there was a mistake, and that you might be connected to him. I found a photo of you and Andrew together, and I believe there's more to your story than we know." Ethan's eyes widened, his young mind struggling to comprehend what Arthur was saying. "But I don't remember. I don't know Andrew." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. "I know, Ethan. I know this is a lot to take in, but you've been carrying a photo of my son since you were a baby. It's possible. It's possible that you're my son, that Andrew survived and you're somehow—" Before Arthur could finish, Ethan shook his head, his face paling as panic began to set in. "No, that's not right. I'm not Andrew. I don't know who he is." Arthur reached out, trying to calm the boy, but Ethan recoiled, his confusion turning to fear. "You don't understand," Ethan cried, standing up and backing away. "I don't know anything about this. I'm just me." Arthur's heart shattered at the sight of Ethan's distress. He had rushed in too fast, overwhelmed the boy with too much, too soon. He had been so consumed by his own desire for answers that he had forgotten that Ethan was just a child who didn't know anything about the past Arthur had been chasing. "Ethan, wait," Arthur started. But the boy had already turned and was running toward the building, tears streaming down his face. Arthur watched helplessly as Ethan disappeared inside, his small figure retreating into the safety of the orphanage walls. Arthur sat back down on the bench, his hands trembling with the weight of what had just happened. He had pushed too hard. He had let his obsession cloud his judgment, and now Ethan was hurt, confused, and scared. The very thing Arthur had feared all along. His own need for closure had driven the boy away. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He looked up to see Jessica standing there, her face a mixture of sadness and resignation. Arthur hadn't even heard her arrive. "I came to find you," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "I didn't expect—" Arthur dropped his head into his hands, the weight of everything crushing him. "I messed it all up, Jess. I scared him. I thought I could find Andrew again, but all I did was push him away." Jessica didn't respond right away. She sat beside him in silence for a moment, then placed a hand gently on his back. "You didn't scare him because you're a bad person, Arthur," she whispered. "You scared him because you're hurting. And you've been carrying this pain alone for so long that you don't know how to stop." Arthur looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I don't know how to let go, Jess. I thought finding Ethan would fill that hole inside me, but it didn't. It just made everything worse." Jessica's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, she reached out and took his hand. "Arthur, you've been trying so hard to find something that can't be replaced. I miss Andrew too, but you have to understand. Whether Ethan is connected to him or not, you can't force him to be Andrew. He's his own person, and he needs you to see him that way." Arthur's chest tightened as he listened to her words. She was right. He had been trying to replace Andrew with Ethan, hoping that somehow it would heal his broken heart. But in doing so, he had lost sight of who Ethan really was, a child who deserved love and care, not the weight of Arthur's grief. "I don't know what to do," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I'm losing everything." "Ethan, you—" Jessica squeezed his hand, her own eyes filled with tears. "You haven't lost me, Arthur. Not yet. But if you keep chasing this idea of Andrew, we're going to lose each other. And I can't bear that." Arthur stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in. He had been pushing Jessica away, chasing after ghosts, and in doing so, he had risked losing the one person who had stood by him through everything. The thought of losing her was unbearable. "I don't want to lose you," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "Then stop chasing ghosts," Jessica replied softly. "Stop running away from the life you still have." Arthur looked toward the orphanage, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had come so close to finding what he thought he wanted, but in the process, he had almost destroyed the life he already had. He took a deep breath, his heart heavy but clear. He needed to make things right, with Ethan, with Jessica, and with himself. "I'll try," Arthur whispered. "I'll try to let go." And for the first time in what felt like years, Arthur allowed himself to breathe. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running from his grief. It was time to face the future, whatever that might look like. The next morning, Arthur sat in his study, staring blankly at the papers and folders scattered across his desk. The photo of Andrew and Ethan was still there, the edges worn and faded from years of neglect. It felt like an anchor, pulling him between two worlds. One where he could let go and move forward, and another where his obsession with the past held him captive. After his conversation with Jessica, Arthur had resolved to take a step back, to stop chasing ghosts. But the lingering questions about Ethan still haunted him. There was something more, something buried beneath the layers of confusion and missing information. He needed answers, if not for himself, then for Ethan. The boy deserved to know the truth about where he came from, even if it wasn't tied to Andrew. That morning, Arthur called Nick Roberts, the private investigator who had been digging into Ethan's past. Arthur felt the weight of urgency pressing down on him as he explained the latest developments, the photo, the mix-up at the hospital, and Ethan's emotional breakdown after their last conversation. Nick listened carefully, his voice steady on the other end of the line. "Arthur, I've been working on this, and I think it's time you know what I've found. I've managed to track down some hospital records related to Andrew's accident." Arthur's heart quickened. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "What did you find?" There was a brief pause before Nick spoke again. There was indeed confusion at the hospital that day. A series of accidents occurred within hours of each other, and the staff was overwhelmed. 2 boys, both around Andrew's age, were brought in. One was pronounced dead at the scene, and the other was admitted in critical condition. The records suggest that there may have been an identity mix-up. Arthur's blood ran cold. He had suspected it, but hearing Nick confirm that a mistake had been made sent shockwaves through him. "A mix-up?" Arthur echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Nick continued, his tone professional but cautious. "It's possible that the boy who was declared dead wasn't Andrew. The surviving child was transferred to another hospital for long-term care, but by the time the mistake was discovered, no one could trace the paperwork back to confirm identities. It seems that child was eventually placed into the system and abandoned." Arthur's head spun as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The surviving child, Ethan, had been abandoned and lost in the foster care system, his true identity erased by a clerical error. And the boy who was declared dead might not have been Andrew at all. "Are you saying Ethan might be my son?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling with the enormity of what Nick was implying. "I can't say for sure, Arthur," Nick replied, his voice firm but gentle. "But the evidence points to the possibility. The only way to know for certain is through a DNA test." Arthur sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. The possibility that Ethan was Andrew, that his son had been alive all these years, lost in the system, was almost too much to comprehend. But he knew what he had to do. "How soon can we arrange for a test?" Arthur asked, his voice shaky but resolute. "I'll make the arrangements," Nick said. "It'll take a few days, but I'll make sure everything is handled discreetly." After ending the call, Arthur stared at the phone for a long time, his mind swirling with emotion. If the test proved that Ethan was Andrew, everything would change. The thought of having his son back, after all these years, was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. How would he explain this to Ethan? To Jessica? Later that evening, Arthur sat with Jessica in their living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. He had been distant all day, lost in his thoughts, but he knew he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. She deserved to know what Nick had found. Jess, Arthur began, his voice heavy with emotion. I talked to Nick today. He found something big. Jessica, who had been reading, set her book down and turned to face him. Her eyes were wary, still raw from the pain of their recent arguments. What is it? Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was a mix-up at the hospital the day Andrew died. Nick found records that suggest the boy we thought was Andrew might not have been him. The boy who survived might have been our son. Jessica's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. What? How is that possible? Arthur explained everything. The confusion at the hospital, the missing records, and the possibility that Ethan had been abandoned and lost in the system as a result of the mix-up. As he spoke, Jessica's expression shifted from disbelief to horror, and finally to an anguished understanding. So, Ethan might be Andrew, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Arthur nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I don't know for sure, Jess, but we're going to do a DNA test to find out. Jessica buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The pain of losing Andrew had nearly destroyed them both, and now, the possibility that their son had been alive all this time, unloved, uncared for, was almost unbearable. I don't know how to feel, she said, her voice muffled through her tears. If it's true, if he's Andrew, we've lost so much time with him. How do we fix that? Arthur moved to sit beside her, wrapping his arms around her as she cried. I don't know, he admitted softly, but we'll figure it out together. I'm sorry, Jess, for everything, for pushing you away, for losing sight of what mattered. Jessica wiped her eyes, leaning into him. I just want to know the truth. I don't think I can handle any more of this uncertainty. Arthur nodded, understanding all too well. The next few days would be filled with anxiety and fear, but they needed the truth. Whatever it was, they would face it together. The following days passed in a blur. Arthur kept himself busy at work, though his mind was constantly drawn back to Ethan, to the possibility that his son was still alive. Jessica was quieter than usual, processing everything in her own way, but they had started to come back together, united by the need for answers. When the day of the DNA test finally arrived, Arthur felt a knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. He had arranged for it to be done discreetly, without Ethan's knowledge. It was the only way to avoid overwhelming the boy any further. After submitting the samples, all Arthur could do was wait. The waiting was excruciating, filled with sleepless nights and constant worry. He tried to prepare himself for both outcomes. Either Ethan was Andrew, or he wasn't. But no matter how much he tried to steel himself, the uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nick called with the results. Arthur's hand shook as he answered the phone, his voice barely steady. Nick? There was a pause, a breath of hesitation on the other end of the line. Arthur, the test came back positive. Arthur's world tilted. He gripped the phone tighter, his knees going weak beneath him. What? Ethan is Andrew, Nick confirmed softly. He's your son. For a moment, Arthur couldn't breathe. The weight of the revelation crashed over him, his vision blurring as tears welled up in his eyes. Andrew is alive. My son is alive. But with the joy came a flood of regret. Regret for all the years lost, for the pain Andrew had endured, and for the way Arthur had almost destroyed his own life chasing the past. Now, he had the chance to make things right, to rebuild what had been shattered. Arthur hung up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to tell Jessica. He had to tell Ethan. And he had to find a way to heal the broken pieces of their family. But most of all, Arthur knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many wounds to mend, but for the first time in years, Arthur felt hope, real, tangible hope, rising within him. Andrew was alive, and Arthur would never lose him again. Arthur couldn't hold back the flood of emotions as he hung up the phone. His son, Andrew, was alive. Right here, in the form of the boy he had come to know as Ethan. It was a truth so powerful and overwhelming that it felt like a second chance, a miracle after 15 long years of grief. But beneath the elation, a shadow of dread lurked. How could he tell Ethan? How would Jessica react when the reality set in? And how would they bridge the painful gap of all those lost years? Arthur stood frozen in his study, staring at the walls, struggling to wrap his mind around it all. He had been chasing this hope for so long, but now that it was real, he felt a twinge of fear. What if Ethan, no, Andrew, didn't want to be part of their family? What if the boy rejected him? With a deep breath, Arthur gathered his thoughts and walked toward the living room, where Jessica was sitting on the couch, lost in a book, but clearly not reading. She glanced up as he entered, her eyes filled with the same anxiety that had plagued them both for days. "Arthur," she asked quietly, setting the book aside, "did you hear from Nick?" He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the news press down on him. "I did." The pause between them seemed to stretch into eternity as Jessica's breath caught, her face paling. "And?" she whispered, though her eyes were already pleading for an answer. "It's him, Jess," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "Ethan is Andrew, our son. He's alive." For a moment, Jessica didn't move. Her eyes widened in shock, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of Arthur's words hit her like a tidal wave, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands as tears welled up in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's alive." Arthur moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. "He's been lost in the system all these years. The hospital mix-up, it's true, but he's alive, and we can bring him home." Jessica shook her head, her tears spilling over. "I don't know how to feel. I'm so happy, but I'm so angry too. He's been out there, alone, and we didn't know." Arthur nodded, understanding her conflicted emotions. "I know. I feel the same way. But right now, we have to focus on the future. We have a chance to make this right." Jessica looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. "What do we do now? How do we tell him?" Arthur's chest tightened. Telling Ethan, or Andrew, as he would now be known, was the hardest part. The boy had been through so much already, and the truth would undoubtedly shake him to the core. But they couldn't keep this from him any longer. He deserved to know who he really was. "We need to talk to him together," Arthur said gently. "We'll sit him down and explain everything. We'll tell him that we're his parents, and that we've found him. But we have to be careful. This is going to be a lot for him to process." Jessica nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "Okay, let's talk to him." Later that afternoon, Arthur and Jessica drove to Children's Haven, the orphanage where they had first seen their son. The air between them was heavy with anticipation and nerves as they walked through the familiar gates. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air, but for Arthur and Jessica, the world felt still and tense. Ethan, Andrew, was sitting on the same bench where Arthur had last spoken to him, the boy's small notebook resting on his lap. His face was calm, but there was an air of uncertainty about him, as though he sensed the gravity of what was about to happen. Arthur's heart pounded as they approached him. Ethan looked up, his bright blue eyes meeting Arthur's, and for a moment, Arthur saw Andrew. His Andrew, the son he had lost so long ago. "Ethan," Arthur began, his voice soft but trembling, "can we talk to you for a moment?" The boy frowned slightly but nodded, closing his notebook as he waited for them to sit beside him. Jessica took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she reached for Arthur's. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice cautious. "Is something wrong?" Arthur exchanged a glance with Jessica before turning to face Ethan directly. "There's something important we need to tell you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about your past." Ethan's frown deepened. "My past?" Arthur nodded, his heart racing. "Yes, we've been looking into your history, trying to understand where you came from. And we've discovered something we never expected." Ethan's eyes widened, his body tensing as though bracing for bad news. "What did you find?" Jessica spoke up then, her voice soft but steady. "Ethan, we believe that you're our son, our biological son. You were born Andrew Donovan. Ethan blinked, confusion clouding his features. What? No, that can't be. I've been here for as long as I can remember. I don't. I don't have parents. Arthur's heart broke at the pain in the boy's voice, but he pressed on gently. There was a mistake, a mix-up at the hospital. 15 years ago, after a terrible accident, you were declared gone. But the truth is, you survived, and somehow, you ended up here. We've done a DNA test, and it proves that you're our son, Andrew. Andrew, stared at them, his young face pale and frozen in shock. For a long moment, he didn't speak, didn't move, as though his mind couldn't process the enormity of what he had just heard. I don't understand, he finally whispered, his voice shaky. You're saying, I'm Andrew? That I'm your son? Jessica leaned in, tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, sweetheart, you're our son. We lost you. We thought you were gone, but you're here, and we've found you. Andrew looked between them, his eyes wide and filled with confusion, pain, and disbelief. But I don't remember you. I don't remember being your son. I don't remember anything. Arthur swallowed hard, his heart aching for the boy who had lost so much. We know, Andrew, and we're not expecting you to understand all of this right away. But we want you to know that we love you. We've always loved you, and we never stopped looking for you. Andrew's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at his hands. I've always been alone. I didn't know anyone was out there looking for me. Jessica reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. You're not alone anymore. You have us, and we want to bring you home. But it's up to you. We know this is a lot to take in, and we'll give you all the time you need. For a long moment, Andrew was silent, his young mind clearly struggling to process everything. His small shoulders trembled as he tried to hold back his tears. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I don't know how to be Andrew. I don't remember. Arthur's chest tightened. He moved closer, wrapping an arm around Andrew's shoulders. You don't have to be anything other than who you are, Andrew. We'll help you. We'll figure this out together. Jessica nodded through her tears. We'll be with you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone. For the first time, Andrew leaned into Arthur's embrace, his small body shaking as the weight of the truth sank in. Arthur held him close, his own tears falling freely as he finally, after so many years, held his son again. The road ahead would be long, full of challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time in 15 years, Arthur felt a sense of peace. He had found his son, and now they could begin to heal together. As they sat there, the sun setting in the distance, Arthur realized that this was just the beginning of their new journey. It wouldn't be easy, but they had something more powerful than the past pulling them forward. Hope for the future. Arthur watched the sun slowly sink beyond the horizon as he held Andrew. Andrew, in his arms. The boy was still trembling, overwhelmed by the truth that had just turned his world upside down. Arthur could feel the weight of Andrew's confusion and pain in his small frame, but also the glimmer of trust slowly forming between them. Jessica sat beside them, her face wet with tears, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of relief, of joy mixed with sorrow, of the profound hope that had taken root in their hearts. Their son, lost for so long, had been found. I want to come home with you, Andrew whispered after what felt like an eternity. His voice was shaky, uncertain, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been missing from his life. Arthur's heart swelled, his chest tight with emotion. You don't have to decide everything right now, Andrew. We'll take things one step at a time. But Andrew shook his head, his young face set with determination. I don't want to stay here anymore. I want to go with you. Jessica reached out, cupping Andrew's face gently, her thumb brushing away his tears. You can come home with us, she said softly. Whenever you're ready, we'll be here for you. And just like that, the impossible had happened. Andrew had chosen to come home, to begin rebuilding the life that had been taken from him all those years ago. For Arthur and Jessica, it felt like a dream, a second chance at the family they had lost. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings with the orphanage, and preparations for Andrew's transition home. Mrs. Collins and the staff at Children's Haven were supportive but understandably cautious. The trauma of such a revelation weighed heavily on everyone involved, and the staff wanted to ensure that Andrew's emotional well-being remained the top priority. Arthur and Jessica worked tirelessly to create a welcoming environment for Andrew at their home. They redecorated his old bedroom, once untouched, frozen in time as a memorial to the son they had thought they'd lost, now transformed into a new, warm space for Andrew. They didn't want to overwhelm him with reminders of his past, so they filled the room with new furniture, soft colors, and thoughtful touches that would make him feel comfortable and safe. On the day Andrew finally came home, Arthur's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He and Jessica waited by the door, the house filled with the quiet tension of anticipation. When the car from the orphanage pulled up, Arthur felt a surge of emotion, so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Their son, after so many years, was coming home. Andrew stepped out of the car, clutching a small bag of belongings, his face a mix of uncertainty and hope. Arthur could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of the unknown, of the new life that awaited him, but also the determination. Andrew was ready to face the future, even if it scared him. Jessica rushed forward, enveloping Andrew in a warm embrace, her tears spilling over as she held him close. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Andrew hugged her back, and for a moment, the years of separation melted away. Arthur stood beside them, his heart so full he thought it might burst. When Jessica stepped back, Arthur knelt down, meeting Andrew's eyes. "We're so happy you're here," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "This is your home now, Andrew. We're your family." Andrew gave a small, tentative smile, his grip tightening on the bag in his hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Inside, the house felt both familiar and new to Andrew. He wandered through the halls, taking in the sights, his eyes wide with wonder as he absorbed the reality of his new life. Arthur and Jessica gave him space, watching quietly as he explored, knowing that this was just the beginning of his journey toward healing. As the weeks passed, Andrew began to settle into his new life with Arthur and Jessica. The transition wasn't easy. There were moments of confusion, sadness, and even anger as Andrew struggled to reconcile his past with his present. But with each day, the bonds between them grew stronger. The love that had been lost for so long was beginning to heal the deep wounds that Andrew had carried all his life. Arthur threw himself into his role as Andrew's father with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent years burying his grief in work, but now, with Andrew back in his life, everything felt different. His focus shifted. His business, once the only thing that kept him afloat, was no longer his main priority. But in a strange and unexpected twist, this shift in priorities led to a remarkable transformation in Arthur's professional life as well. With his emotional burden lifted, Arthur approached his business with newfound clarity and creativity. Ideas that had once seemed impossible flowed freely, and he found himself making decisions that propelled the company forward in ways he hadn't anticipated. His colleagues and business partners noticed the change in him. Arthur was no longer the distant, grief-stricken man they had once known. He was energized, engaged, and full of life. As his business began to thrive, Arthur realized that the weight of his grief had been holding him back for years. Now, with Andrew in his life again, he was free to embrace his future, both personally and professionally. The success that followed wasn't just financial. It was a reflection of the emotional healing that had begun to take root in his life. At home, Andrew continued to flourish. He and Arthur spent time together doing the things they had missed out on for years, playing basketball in the driveway, watching movies, and working on school projects. Though the memories of their past were still fragile, Arthur and Andrew were building new ones, piece by piece, day by day. Jessica, too, felt the change. The distance that had once separated her from Arthur had dissolved, replaced by a deeper bond forged through their shared love for Andrew. Together, they navigated the challenges of parenting a child who had been through so much. And though it wasn't always easy, they faced it together, united by their love for their son. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Arthur looked at Andrew, who was laughing at one of Jessica's jokes. The boy's face was brighter, his laughter genuine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. They had lost so much, but they had found their way back to each other. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had brought them to this moment, a moment of hope, of healing, of love. Arthur reached out and took Jessica's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with the same sense of peace. Across the table, Andrew looked at them both, his blue eyes reflecting the warmth of the family he had finally found. And in that moment, Arthur knew they were whole again. As the months passed, life at the Donovan household began to settle into a new, beautiful rhythm. The house that had once been steeped in sorrow now felt alive with warmth and laughter. Andrew's presence, once a reminder of the painful loss they had endured, became a symbol of their collective strength, their second chance at a life they thought they'd lost forever. Arthur woke each morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He no longer rushed out the door to bury himself in work, desperate to avoid the grief that had consumed him after Andrew's accident. Instead, his mornings were filled with the simple joy of spending time with his son. Whether that meant helping Andrew with homework, chatting over breakfast, or walking him to the school bus. Each day, Andrew seemed to grow more comfortable in his new life. The transition hadn't been easy at first, but slowly, the boy began to relax into the rhythms of being part of a family again. There were moments when Arthur and Jessica could see the pain of Andrew's past flicker in his eyes, the years he had spent in the orphanage, alone, wondering if anyone had ever loved him. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between, replaced by the quiet, steady confidence of a boy who knew he was finally home. At school, Andrew began to thrive. The teachers, initially concerned about his emotional state, reported that he was making friends, participating in class, and excelling in subjects he hadn't previously shown interest in. The boy who had once been withdrawn, unsure of his place in the world, was blossoming into a bright, kind-hearted young man. Arthur and Jessica marveled at the changes in their son. They spent countless hours talking about the future, about what Andrew's life might look like now that he had been given a new start. They both knew that they couldn't erase the years of pain and loneliness he had endured, but they were committed to building a new life together, one where Andrew would never have to feel lost or unloved again. Arthur's professional life, too, had undergone a transformation. With Andrew back in his life, the relentless drive to prove himself through business had softened. He still loved his work, but his priorities had shifted. Arthur found himself focusing less on the bottom line and more on the people around him. The employees, the clients, the partners who had supported him through his darkest years. His colleagues noticed the change. Arthur was no longer the aloof, grief-stricken man who had once thrown himself into work as a means of escape. Now, he was present, engaged, creative, and filled with a quiet confidence that had eluded him for years. Under his renewed leadership, the company began to flourish in ways Arthur had never anticipated. Profits were up, new projects were underway, and the atmosphere in the office felt lighter, more collaborative. At first, Arthur's business partners were skeptical of his new approach. They had grown accustomed to his single-minded pursuit of success and worried that his focus on family might detract from his work. But as time went on, they realized that Arthur's newfound balance was exactly what the company needed. He was no longer trying to outrun his grief. He was finally leading from a place of peace, and it showed in everything he did. Clients, too, responded to the change. Arthur's empathy and personal touch became a hallmark of his business dealings, and new opportunities began to present themselves. His reputation as a shrewd but compassionate leader spread, and soon, the company was experiencing unprecedented growth. But for Arthur, the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the knowledge that he was finally living a life that felt whole. He had reclaimed his role as a father and husband, and in doing so, had become the man he had always wanted to be, both in business and in life. At home, the evenings were now filled with the sound of laughter, something Arthur had feared he would never hear again. He, Jessica, and Andrew spent their time playing board games, watching movies, and taking weekend trips to places they had once dreamed of visiting. Their home, once a mausoleum of grief, had become a sanctuary of love and healing. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Andrew asked a question that took them by surprise. "Do you think I'll ever remember what it was like before?" he asked quietly, his fork resting on his plate. "I mean, before the accident. When I was really Andrew." Arthur and Jessica exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the weight of Andrew's question. He had asked about his past before, but it was always hesitant, as though he wasn't sure he wanted the answers. This time, however, there was a quiet strength in his voice, a readiness to face the parts of his life that had been hidden from him for so long. "I don't know," Arthur said honestly, his voice soft. "Maybe one day, some memories will come back. But even if they don't, that doesn't change who you are, Andrew. You're still our son, no matter what you remember." Jessica reached across the table and took Andrew's hand. "We've lost a lot of time, but that doesn't mean we can't make new memories, ones that will stay with you forever." Andrew smiled, his blue eyes reflecting the love and warmth that now surrounded him. "I like that," he said quietly. "Making new memories." Arthur's heart swelled with pride. This boy, this strong, resilient boy, was no longer the frightened child he had met at the orphanage. He was Andrew Donovan, their son, and he was carving out a future filled with love and possibility. As time passed, the bond between Arthur, Jessica, and Andrew grew stronger. They had faced the unimaginable, and though the road to healing had been long and difficult, they had made it through, together. There were still challenges, of course. Andrew had moments of doubt, moments when he struggled with the memories of his past and the uncertainty of his future. But each time, Arthur and Jessica were there, guiding him, supporting him, and reminding him that he was never alone. On a warm summer evening, the three of them sat outside on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the air filled with the soft sounds of crickets and birds settling in for the night. Andrew sat between Arthur and Jessica, his head resting on his father's shoulder. They were silent, content in each other's presence, the weight of the past finally lifting from their hearts. For Arthur, this moment, this simple, quiet moment, was the culmination of everything he had fought for. He had lost his son once, but through the darkest of times, he had found him again. And now, the future stretched out before them, bright and filled with possibility. "I love you, Dad," Andrew whispered, his voice sleepy but sincere. Arthur's chest tightened, his throat thick with emotion. He wrapped his arm around his son, pulling him close. "I love you too, Andrew, more than you'll ever know." And in that moment, Arthur realized that they had finally found their way back to each other. The past no longer held them captive. They were free, free to love, free to heal, free to create the life they had always dreamed of. Together, they watched as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. And for the first time in years, Arthur felt truly at peace.